Hey, what's up, everyone? So, first of all, welcome to Chapter 2. I hope you got your feet wet in Chapter 1 and have sort of figured out the ins and outs of the discussion and sort of what I expect from you. I've noticed that a lot of you haven't quite got this far yet, but I'm looking forward to uh, all the extra work you put into this. Um, this chapter lecture is on chapter 2, which focuses on geography. And it's a really good starting point for us as we continue to build this foundation of understanding global issues and understanding the world around us. Uh, Certainly understanding, both the human interactions as well as the physical interactions that humans have with the world around them is a very important component to understanding global studies as well as global issues. Um, Normally, we split these geography into two contexts. One is physical, and the other one is human. Uh, and in the modern day view of geographical studies, the technology and the integration of technology and how the information age has transformed how we see the world around us, how we can predict future outcomes is really tremendous and is a continually evolving field. And it's interesting, when we grow up, we take geography in high school or maybe middle school, and you learn, or you basically get pictures of maps, right? And maps around the world. And sometimes you see maps that give you little bits of information about population or other things. So maps are an important component. They tell an important story. But there's also a story behind the map or the implications of what the maps say to us. And so that's the part that's really important that we begin to understand with regard to how human beings have influenced, for better or for worse, the global system that we live in. There are many examples that we could focus on here, or many issues to look at, like for example population growth, which certainly you could argue strains the Earth's capacity to be able to sustain itself. It could, in fact, for one example, like food supply. The strain on the Earth's food supply is known as the Malthusian dilemma, and basically it has a lot to do with food insecurity and how it comes about and what the future of food insecurity is going to look like for the rest of the world. There's also a broader context beyond that when you have large populations that have impacts on energy demands, oil, coal, other non-renewable fuels and resources, and just the impact and taxation on the physical environment. When you talk about like the Amazon rainforest and things like that, and all the other uh, problems and issues and concerns that we look at today regarding the physical world that we live in. So, for example, there are four main ways that humans basically uh, have contributed to the decline of our physical environment. And, like, for example, the first one's called deforestation. So, you're talking about as we chop away the world's forest and for technology or for other uses, that impact has a tremendous uh, blow to the physical world and the ozone layers of our atmosphere. Also desertification. So you have rivers and lakes and oceans that are starting to recede and dry up. That has a huge impact as well on physical environment. And then also water pollution, and then of course the elephant in the room that overrides all these is climate change. And so understanding, that all this is man-made, which means that we also have the ability to solve these problems, is what we'll be looking at in this chapter. Uh, and when I talk about, having it be more of a solution-based ending to the chapter, it really does focus on three primary things that we usually call the three R's. And that means that we talk about like reducing carbon emissions, for example, or reuse, how we reutilize like paper and plastic when we have recycle that we have at our homes now. And then recycle, which is just that, being able to recycle the goods and reuse them. So those are the three aspects where we can help begin to solve the mess that we've created. Uh, it's interesting to note that here we sit in the 21st century and we marvel at all the innovation we have, and yet at the same time we forget the consequences of our actions. So Hopefully, after this chapter, you'll be a little kinder to Mother Earth, and you'll also have the chance to learn a little bit more about how she works. So, without further ado, we're going to jump into the PowerPoints, and while you will not see my face, you will hear my voice. Okay? All right, let's get going. So chapter one, again, focuses on, the sort of the global environment. I mean, not chapter one, pardon me. Chapter two, where was I at? Chapter two focuses on the global environment and how we as human beings interact with the global environment. And it really begins with what we call the global commons. And the global commons basically is the natural asset of planet Earth, what I call Mother Earth, that is available to all of us. Um, we talk about it in context of fresh air, clean fresh air, healthy and a healthy environment, and healthy and vibrant, accessible oceans, and also outer space. And how we go about protecting those resources is an important part of what we call the global commons. It's basically that what we as human beings share across the entire world with other human beings. And it certainly requires people to use it responsibly and to protect it and to make sure that we save and protect it for future generations, for our kids and our kids' kids. And some of the challenges that we face as a result of that really have to do with how we manage, our connectedness to the planet. How do we manage our relationship to the planet from the various aspects that we'll be looking at in this chapter? And this is really the study of the geography in the context of global issues and global studies. So understanding that, there's lots of different things when you look at the Earth from space and you see the physical mass, that's certainly one aspect of Earth that we begin with, right? So you can see the mountains, the oceans, the deserts, rivers, forests, fields, etc. And those tell us a story about the planet, and it tells us also about how the environments have changed. So we can take a map that was done 100 years ago, for example, and then take a map that was done, say, yesterday, and the same area, looking at the same areas and assess, well, what looks the same and what looks different, right? Uh, and so so that's an important component for us that also tells us a story. But one of the biggest challenges is that we don't have one point where we can observe the entire entity of the planet in one location. You would have to have cameras literally all around the world taking snapshots simultaneously to get a rendition of something that would be able to tell you the whole story at once. Uh, but that's not quite even that. Even though it's a challenge, it's not unresolvable if we do what we need to do to make sure that that happens. So to recognize that, you know, and the study of this goes back to even in ancient times, where some of the great philosophers of the ancient age, going back to Aristophanes, who was the first person to sort of do scientific calculations of the Earth, and then moving from him into Ptolemy, who was the first to map longitude and latitude of the planet. So since ancient time, man has always been trying to figure out, you know, just what planet Earth was and how it was constructed, and in terms of its physical realm. Remember how many people thought that planet Earth was flat, thought the world was flat, and that if you got to the edge, you would go off. And this was actually true even up to the early 20th century. So it's interesting to note how even as we were starting to evolve and develop a view of the planet without having been to space, there were a lot of people who were still struggling with trying to come up with their own ideas about what planet Earth was, and where she, how where she was, where all the parts began and end. Did lots of it's interesting to see some of the ancient maps and how they were derived, and what their view of the world was when you look back, that either 1,000, 2,000, or 500 years ago, and with the information and that they had and the technology they had at that day, really told them a story about the Earth as well. And certainly, it's a time where we have to always be able to reassess and reevaluate, as the Earth and how she has grown, over this period of time as well. And that's one of the things that we do while looking at the human impact on the physical environment. So again, I mentioned earlier about the two branches of geography, the human, which of course studies the interaction between humans with the environment, and then the physical, which is the study of the earth and its resources. And both are intertwined and both are necessary. One doesn't exist without the other, and one cannot be solved with the problems of the physical environment cannot be solved without the human interaction and human interface with the environment and how we decide to manage that. Uh, and then, as you can see there, they also discuss the issue of cartography, which is the study of maps, which again, to tell us a lot about the various borders that exist. It's always funny when when I remember being a kid and looking at maps of the United States, for example, and you see all these, here's California, here's Washington, here's Florida, etc. But when you see a picture of the Earth from space, there's none of those little lines that you see on the maps that actually exist, right? So it's interesting to note how we draw a lot of context about how we see ourselves, even geographically, within the states we reside in. Uh, that when you're, even 100 miles up, looking back at, down at the country, none of that exists. Uh, so it's all about how we choose to perceive the environment around us. Um, and then also when we talk about the issue of sort of topographical maps, which again denote the sort of physical features of the planet, and how they're in relation to one another. So whether it be like mountains and streams and rivers and various elevations that tell us also a story about uh, the terrain of our environment, physical environment. But then you also have other types of topography, and it has to do with, like, they have political maps, for example, that show you where, say, for example, where the Democrats are, where the Republicans are, where certain groups reside, whether they be religious groups or other types of groups. They have maps that just denote economic distinctions of where the rich live, where the poor live, social and cultural maps that show you where various groups live, not just in our own country, but even around the world. So we have maps that describe all different types of entities and interactions about with humans around the world. Uh, and so it also allows us to be able to look at regionally and internationally, and it tells those organizations that work in these areas, um, it gives them a window into where cooperation exists and where it does not exist. So that's the part that's really important for them in that realm. Um, Also, uh, as we sort of wrap our heads around these ideologies, uh, it's also about understanding the role of, this sort of geographic information systems, also known as what we call GIS. And this is the use of technology, the use of computers and satellite imagery, and some of the new technology I mentioned earlier, to help tell us a story about geography and how it changes. And this is also how we're able to assess, like, even issues like climate change. I remember flying back from Oxford several years ago and flying over the North Pole and coming back down. And usually it's always nice and white and looking all snowy. And I remember we get down to Greenland as you come over the North Pole and you're coming south, and it was all brown. And I kept thinking, is there something wrong with this? Like, what's it doing brown here? And it's ironic because you can physically see what's transpired and what is now the issue within the environment regarding global warming, if you would, or climate change. Um, Also, so as we move on here, we can also talk about, how, the like Mother Earth has the beauty of being able to protect herself and heal herself if provided the opportunity. But we have to be also very careful about the fact that there are finite resources on the planet. Like, for example, oil. Oil is not is it doesn't regrow itself, and so as you use up resources, the ability of the planet to be able to heal itself, and whether how limited it is to do so, is why we have to devise certain solutions to figure out how to clean up the mess of what we call technological advancement. And a lot of times, it's interesting to note if you go back in the last 150, 200 years, things that we tried to do for the right reasons, they weren't done nefariously, have actually turned out to be rather disastrous. But once you figure out that that what you're doing is causing other problems, you're supposed to begin to solve those issues, right? That's the notion. Okay. Um, so, another part of the component that we look at is also the aspect of like where we live and where how people settle. And again, if you're looking at maps of the world and topography, and you were looking at a map and you saw, you were trying to figure out, well, where did people in ancient times, or millions of years ago, where did cavemen settle? Well, you could easily assess that. Well, most of the time they settled in areas where there were water or food resources. You normally wouldn't expect them to settle where there was, snow and it was frigid. You would think them to be in warmer climates when possible, where there was available food and water. And so those kinds of things help, again, help us also sort of assert uh, some basic presumptions about human beings over the last several thousand years, if not several million years. Uh, and then it also tells us a story about, well, why did, if people are not living in certain areas, why do those things happen? Why do people relocate, or become refugees? And sometimes, and usually it's the case of course, civil war, civil crisis. Sometimes it's due to famine, where people are looking for food resources or environments change and they're, become inhospitable. Uh, there is uh, the last estimate I remember seeing around and said that in 2020, about 80 million people were estimated to be displaced from their homes because of these issues that we're talking about. Whether they're escaping violence or other issues, that people are being pushed out of their natural locations and natural environments into other locations and environments, which also has an impact on those new environments that they're moving into, right? Okay. Uh, so here we're talking about, again, the struggle between, as the world has become smaller, the struggle between social and cultural divisions. And, when you are working, or, it used to be along border areas, you always had these kinds of issues, but it's also a matter of integration of different people into other areas that has also created a little bit of a struggle as well. When you talk about, people bring their culture, their history, all the things that make them who they are from wherever they come from, and they bring that and they assimilate that into a society. So, like the United States, I've always said that one of the things that makes us somewhat of a good country in some ways is our diversity, the diversity of people who comprise the United States. But I've also said that it's one of our greatest weaknesses, that we struggle with our diversity. People like Chinese food and don't like Chinese people, or they like Mexican food and don't like Mexican people, or they like soul food but don't like black people, or the other way around. Just people have all types of assumptions and all types of misunderstandings about things that they find different from what they know in their natural environment. And so this is also one of the struggles that we have, in ways that we also have to be able to analyze and look at the human aspect of geography. Um, and then when we talk about ideas of like how do we go about managing the population, and obviously if you see some maps here, as I'll be showing you shortly, you'll see how most of the rapid growth of the world's population resides in the poorer countries. The richer countries are having less babies, and the poorer countries are having more babies. Uh, Sometimes it's related directly to education and other, culture. And there's also, places like China where, for a long time, if they would allow one child per family, and then unfortunately, because how they see women in those societies, they would, if they had a baby born, or they knew it was going to be a baby girl, they would, do horrible things to the fetus or abort them. Uh, so those things are things that we still struggle with regard to, again, and also the issue of, like we said earlier, the planet does have finite resources. So how do we address that and be able to continue to have growth, the growth that's coming in poorer regions, and that don't have the capabilities to sustain or survive. With the children and families in those areas don't have the ability to survive. So those are ongoing issues as we look at this. This shows you, for example, the world's most populous countries. You can see here China and India are the most populous countries. India is considered the most populous country in the world. Um, well, right now, well, considered actually, I think India has already surpassed China. Even though the picture here shows you uh, in 2020, but it's really, really, really close. And I think, and again, you can see here by 2050, they'll be long past China by that point. And you can see most of the rest of the countries here, like the United States and Mexico and Russia and other places, have much, much smaller populations. Ironically, you will find that the poor countries are much more populous, but their wealth, and actually the poorer countries have actually more resources, natural resources, but they're controlled by the wealthy countries that are usually called the global north. So the global north, what is called the global north, are usually considered richer countries, more the European countries, United States, Canada, and so forth. And then the global south, except for Australia, are considered usually the poorer countries. This just gives you some more examples of population management and things like that. Again, as I mentioned, China just a moment ago, they have population control. They have really, really almost draconian laws when it comes to some of this stuff in terms of they would allow in the rural areas for to have more than one child to support if they have for agriculture and stuff like that. So the farmers were allowed to have more because that helped produce food for the country. The Chinese policy had been condemned by human rights activists for a very long time because, the female babies were either abandoned or killed because they wanted baby boys. Uh, and so, this had again a reciprocal effect. There was a disproportionate number of males, which resulted in underemployment and a lot of social isolation, and became a source of political opposition in the country. So there are consequences or I should actually call it unintended consequences for the actions that are committed. Again, just more examples of population management. Now, when we talk about food and hunger issues here, one of the things that we talk about, and as I mentioned to you before, is again there is capacity to be able to meet the needs of the population. And when we talk about the five levels of Maslow's five levels of human needs, he talks about it in the terms of sufficient amounts of food and clean water, safety, sense of belonging, self-esteem, and self-actualization. Those are Maslow's five levels of human needs. So, in terms of survivability that we carry as human beings, these are the basis of how we see that. And then I mentioned earlier also in my opening monologue about the Malthusian dilemma, uh, which basically has to deal with the reality of the scarcity of food, or I should say, the growth of population, which therefore could potentially create food scarcity, and the crisis uh, become the reality or come to fruition as a result. So this is what we call the Malthusian dilemma. Uh, and then again, because you figure whoever's got the food, then others are going to want that or want to be able to access. So this will lead to there's a conflict of some sort as a result of that. And then, of course, as we talked about deforestation, which is again destruction of the forest, and particularly the Amazon rainforest is one of the biggest points of contention. Again, the impact of geographical changes that also has a huge impact. The issue of regarding natural disasters, forest fires, that actually, or destruction of crops as a result of desertification, environmental degradation through overuse of the arable lands and fertilizers that have a negative effect. Uh, the idea of sufficient that their availability is undermined by civil wars, for example. There are a lot of things that are causal factors for uh, the lack of food or the food and hunger crisis that happens every day on planet Earth. Uh, Certainly, some of the other peripheral issues deal with the issue of pesticides and chemicals that are used that affect the soil, which then affects the food that we eat. Uh, so there are all kinds of things and even when we talk about things that we do to try and enhance food, with growth hormone and all types of stuff that we put into the food that actually creates that is actually not considered not good for the human body, but in order to create more food, we do this. We put fillers in things, so that's how that works. Yes, there are organizations, like the Food and Agriculture Organization that reports out this information regarding some of the numbers, which are pretty disturbing about the number of undernourished people on planet Earth. It's been increasing since 2015. There are probably just under a billion people who suffer from hunger issues in the world today. Uh, and a huge chunk of that number live in the global south. Probably three quarters of them live in what we call the global south, with India and China embracing a huge chunk of that number, along with Eastern and Sub-Saharan Africa. So again, we talk about this with regard to, again, the lack of access to safe and good food, as I've mentioned, and the impact directly to children and to those who are in greater need is something that we really have to be able to uh, create an infrastructure and help those agencies be able to reach out and provide for those who have the greatest need. Again, these are just some charts that show you where the undernourished populations in the world are. You see most of these are in Africa, as you can see on this particular chart. And then again, when we talk about, even with regard to aid and reaching out to some of these poorer countries, there's so much corruption, there's distribution issues, there's logistic issues, safety issues. With the countries having a civil war, is it safe to even go in and try and deliver food resources in some of these areas? The cost of getting food to these areas, the supply chain. Everybody wants to get paid, even when they're trying to do the right thing. So it's very, very complicated, and it's quite a business. And usually the people who suffer are the ones who don't even get to the food and money, and the resources go to individuals who end up utilizing it for their own personal needs. Or there's corruption within the government that a lot leads to these types of things. And then we talk about energy security. Again, we're talking about, the ecosystem of the world, and we're talking about, just in terms of how uh, the types of energy that we utilize, and because of the ecosystem, the lifestyle and consumption choices that we determine are what lead to the fragility of the world's natural ecosystem. The more energy we need, the more we have to find creative ways and new ways to be able to get energy. So, like for example, nuclear energy and how to use nuclear energy safely, uh, or solar energy, or wind energy. There's lots of different ways we have to figure out a way to be able to utilize these resources and not also drain the Earth's resources as well in the process. So when we talk about things like nuclear energy, which had at one point been, really popular in most of the Western countries, particularly 1960s and 70s and even into the 80s. But then with some nuclear accidents like Chernobyl, uh, and then the threat of what happens when you have to, with the waste from nuclear, what we call nuclear waste, because things like carbon 14, they have a 12,000-year lifespan. And so trying to bury this stuff in the planet, what do these things do to the earth itself? And can the earth actually heal itself when you put these toxic uh, energies into the earth, into the planet itself? So again, we've talked about, there's lots of other, issues with regard to, like, there was a gas leak that happened in India that killed thousands of people. There's a Deepwater Horizon oil rig. There's all these things that have happened as a result of our quest for more energy and the consequences that happen as a result of those things, whether they're oil spills or whether gas leaks or nuclear radiation. There's all these things we have to consider when we have new technologies and how we go about utilizing them. Um, and of course, obviously, the human impact of all this. So we look at, again, how human beings impact I should say the activities of human beings have impact on the environment and the consequences of these things. So, when we talk about, global warming and climate change or depletion of the rainforest or desertification, pollution of water supply or lowering air quality. How much have we contributed to this, and the consequences of these things, uh, are directly inherent. So, for example, approximately 31% of the Earth's surface is covered by forest, and roughly about 18, almost 19 million acres of forest are lost each year. So that tells you that there's a consequence, and the consequence usually is that if you think about it globally, and it's basically about 54 million jobs are tied directly to or indirectly to this particular sector of deforestation. So when clearing out the forest provides opportunities for cultivating crops and for grazing animals and things like that. Uh, but it also, if you take too much, then the earth has trouble, and the consequences have an impact on the environment and the atmosphere of our planet. So these are the things that we have to be able to sort of reassess as we, go forward and try and figure out how to fix what we've created. Some other factors, of course, water resource is always a huge factor. One that we've always struggled with is, because it is a direct known fact that the amount of potable water available on the planet is diminishing year by year. Potable water means that water that was available to drink, safely drink. And so, we have desalination, we have all kinds of things we try to utilize to be able to deal with this. We realize, I don't know if you realize this, but about 850 million people lack access to safe water supplies on the planet today. About 850 million people. And nearly a million people die from water, sanitation, and hygiene related illnesses every year. Um, the pollution caused by industrial waste into the water supply is incredibly problematic. Particularly now, we just realized even in our own country, what we think is safe water, there's so much lead in our water that they're now discussing, even here in the United States, how they're going to try to solve this problem with cleaning up the water that we drink out of our faucets, for those who drink out of the faucet. And I will admit that I still occasionally do, because it's supposed to be reasonable water. Uh, and then, then of course there's also, because of water. In fact, it is also known that and many have theorized that the future conflicts in the world will not be because of who's got the biggest weapons, but it'll be over water. That water will be the bane of our future wars, as we look for the resources and access to those resources. This just shows you the human factor regarding carbon emissions. So you can see China is over here with 10.065. US is about half of that. Then India, Russia, Japan. But the top five basically contribute to three-quarters of the carbon emissions on the planet. And that's why we have to do a much better job. Of course, the response to this has been, of course, they've had many summits, going back to the Earth Summit in 1992, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. Then they've had other conferences or conventions since that time to try and assess, what we can do. And unfortunately, the biggest weakness in that comes from the reality of the economic gain, and people will think money is more important than people. And under capitalism, that's always the case. So there's always a reason why they will justify why they can't fix stuff, or the solutions take years to resolve, because the politics of it all is what gets in the way. And no matter what these are, it really does lead us down a path that is that is really unsustainable. So it's interesting as a political scientist and also a professor of global studies, it's interesting to note that all the things we talk about don't really matter if we kill the planet, right? Because then you'll need sunscreen 5000, and nobody wants to wear sunscreen 5000. Lastly here, so what can we do? And I said I was going to end with this part of it. And so the last thing I would tell you is that, again, we think about those three R's. And about part of it has to do with utilizing renewable energy resources, things like solar panels, and using dual pane windows and things like that. Also, cutting the number of airplane flights, and even utilizing clotheslines instead of using our dryers in our homes. All these things help us be in a way that it seems simplistic, but are pivotal in terms of how we go about solving some of these issues. As I said, those three R's, reduce the amount of waste generated, reuse the way of reducing waste. I mean, reuse the items that we have, and then recycle, turning the waste into other usable items are the ways that we help, basically reduce our carbon footprint and the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced every day on the planet. This particular chart shows you the green gas emitters by by sector. So transportation has about 30% of it, energy industry about 27%, in general industries, multiple different industries, about 22%. Agriculture is about just under 10%, commercial about 6%, and residential is about 5%. So all of us are responsible in some way, shape, or form for trying to make the world a better place and a safer place. Um, and our ability as humans to solve these problems is the first step in making sure that we provide a safe haven for future generations to be able to uh, not only survive the planet but thrive on this planet in the future. So let's do our job to make sure that we do that. All right, that's it for chapter 2. I will see you for chapter 3, and have a great day. Bye.